Hello and welcome to the God a Case of Wanderlust podcast. Thank you for being here. My name is Lydia and I'm your host. We are continuing a series that I have based off the article I wrote about neocolonialism, which you can find on my travel blog, godacaseofwanderlust.com, which will be in the show notes. But this is the audio version, and I invite us all to enter this space as open-minded and willing to learn as possible, because I really believe as travelers, it's our responsibility to use our privilege when exploring new places, when exploring another person's home, to try to be as less negatively impactful as we possibly can, and to learn and grow in doing something that we all love, which is travel. So my aim with this, opening this, can of worms, is to hopefully invite us to be better travelers. And today we're going to be diving into the objectification / exoticism of foreign cultures. And most specifically in this episode, we're going to be talking about cultural appropriation and cultural commodification, which are two ways that cultures can be objectified. So let's just dive straight in. I'm going to start off with a quote by St. Augustine of Hippo, who once said that the world is a book, and those who do not travel read only one page. Now, this is a nice quote, but there's some things to dive into about it. So yes, of course, traveling allows you to see different ways of life in environments outside of your comfort zone. That's one of the most enriching ways travel can, change us as people, getting out of our comfort zone. But how much learning, I argue, are we actually doing if we're seeing through a skewed lens? So I'd like to argue it's not travel itself that changes you, but really the willingness to learn and how open your mind is when traveling. Because if it's closed, I don't know, I think you're kind of limiting yourself there. And so this starts with biases, confronting our biases. And just to preface, biases are a normal human tendency. They're evolutionary traits which basically means we're seeing life through our own perspective. So from an evolutionary standpoint, they're helpful because they allow us to make quick judgments in the absence of more information or not enough time to think more critically, which in the past potentially saved our lives in threatening situations. However, this also means that we tend to view people and places in ways that diminish their complexities to conform to the narratives or biases that we have about them. And when we fail to consider the totality of a person or place, we risk participating in these neocolonialist mindsets. Cultural appropriation. This is I feel like a super big topic that is, it's tricky to talk about because it's hard to identify sometimes, and it's controversial in that not everyone agrees on what is or what is not cultural appropriation. But let's just start off with the definition. So cultural appropriation is when an item or practice of significance from a historically oppressed culture is taken and used by a dominant culture without mutual agreement. Now, the historically oppressed culture is really key here, because it's not cultural appropriation if the item or practice of significance is from a dominant group in society, aka white, heterosexual men, Anglo-Saxon, So again, as I mentioned, this is a complex issue, and it can range from obvious or very difficult to identify. Now, one example that I found, or the way that it commonly manifests, is through fashion. And our example today is Gucci's 2018 fall-winter fashion show, when white models went down the runway wearing traditional turbans. So if you don't know what they look like or what they are, turbans are religiously significant garments that can be worn by men or women who practice the religions of Sikhism, Islam, or Hinduism. But rather than hire models of color who actually wear these pieces for religious purposes, or even acknowledge their religious significance and origins, Gucci took sole credit for the outfits. Even out of ignorance, using religious items outside of their religious context is cultural appropriation. And it's problematic because it fails to recognize a culture's role in preserving a cultural practice and strips the item away from its cultural identity and history. This leads to cultural erasure, which means the culture has less visibility and power, and thus maintains unequal power imbalances between dominant cultures and historically oppressed cultures. So again, I'm repeating it again because this is a really big topic, and I really, really, really encourage you, if you are still unclear about what it is, I'm really trying my best to kind of break it down in the most simplest terms, but it's a bit tricky in podcast form. So to just do your own research about it, find an article that makes sense to you so you could really understand what it is. Because again, this does affect society. This can be something that you can perpetuate, and so being aware of what it is and how you can avoid it is super, super important to be a better human and to be respectful of all groups of people. So let's just briefly get into how you can avoid it. Cultural appropriation can be downright detrimental and disrespectful to cultures. In order to avoid it, we can practice cultural appreciation. Unlike cultural appropriation acknowledges and gives credit to something's historical and cultural significance before using it. This ensures that the item or practice is not detached from its original origins and potentially erased from the original culture. It's also important to ensure the original community is okay with outsiders utilizing it for themselves. So in the case of religious things, however, you should probably just avoid them in general, because if you're not practicing that religion yourself, you aren't using it in the original way, which is for a spiritual purpose. So some things you might ask yourself before wearing something or partaking in a specific practice that you think might be cultural appropriation. Ask yourself, do I understand the historical and cultural implication of this item or practice? Or is the original community of this item or practice okay with outsiders using it? And how can I honor and give credit to the original community if I'm using it? Ultimately, taking inspiration from other cultures is not a bad thing. It's a beautiful thing. I mean, to live in the multicultural world that we do today, like seeing and getting inspiration from other parts of the world is incredible. But we have to really reflect on how we do it and be mindful, if we are doing it problematically, to be humble about it and to correct and adjust. So now let's get into cultural commodification, which is one step further from cultural appropriation. So this is when a cultural practice or item is not only removed from its historical roots, but it's turned into a commodity for those outside of the culture. The main focus is on the economic benefits of a culture rather than the preservation and honoring of the culture itself. So there's so many ways culture is commodified / appropriated. Again, cultural commodification is a form of cultural appropriation, but it's the economic version. And two examples of this are slum tourism and tribal tours. Slum tourism, or it's also known as poverty tourism, is when tourists participate in tours that visit slums, I put this in quotes, or impoverished areas of a city. And then tribal tours are experiences where tourists visit indigenous communities. Now, both examples are meant to dive deeper into the culture of a destination, which again, good intentions, but often the reality is the objectification of local people for the benefit of outside tour companies and not local communities. And not to mention, a culture that's been commodified for tourist consumption is usually altered in some way to make the culture more approachable or accessible for tourists, and is consequently not an accurate representation of the culture. So what you may think is, an authentic way to experience a culture is actually just altered for tourists. So an example of this is the Balinese kikak dance. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, which originates in Bali, Indonesia. And this is a sacred dance typically used to communicate with Sang Hyang. Again, oh my god, I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing this. I've never been to Indonesia. I really would love to go, but I'm unfamiliar with these terms. This is just off research that I've done. So this term, anyway, the Sanghyang is the term used by many Balinese for the source of all existence. So despite its deeply spiritual origins, the dance is now a popular tourist spectacle. Not only has the dance been commodified, but it's been modified to fit tourists' desires. And in an article by researcher Angos Tinnis in Commodification of Culture in Bali in the Frame of Cultural Tourism, she cites that tourists do not like to see long performances or the quote-unquote savage scenes during the dances, so they're actually cut from the original dance. So again, what you're seeing may not be in the actual quote-unquote authentic version of the dance that is actually practiced in the local communities. And I say authentic hesitantly because we're going to be diving into this in future episodes, why this term is kind of problematic. But anyway, exploiting a certain group with less power, aka local communities that rely on tourism financially, by a group with more power, aka tourists with spending money, is colonialist in nature because the latter group is imposing their influence on the former group in a way that alters their previous way of being. I just want to reiterate that there's so many more examples of cultural commodification and appropriation that I won't get into in this, overview of the terms, but in every place you visit, there are examples of it. It's unfortunate, but if a destination has tourists, then something is likely appropriated or commodified. It's not always colonialist in nature, but again, as tourists, now that we're aware of these practices, we can more successfully discern if what we're engaging with is problematic or not. And if it is, to again use your privilege, your responsibility as a tourist with more power in the situation to either remove yourself from the situation to not perpetuate it further, or to educate others on it. And if you're traveling with a group of other people, to open their minds to how this may not be for the benefit of the destination. And again, to just be a better traveler. So that concludes this episode for today. On the next episode, we're going to be diving into exoticism, which underlies both cultural appropriation and cultural commodification. But it's a huge topic that I'll save for a future episode, so I'll see you there, and thank you so much for listening.